paper to this conference, and you already mentioned my co-author, so it's David Aikman, Mikael, Juselius, and Xing, and given two of us are at the Center Bank or the BIS, obviously the usual disclaimer applies, but these are our views, not those. The BIS or the Bank of Finland. Now, it is sort of very well known that we can have very deep contractions which sort of have scarring or very long run effects. This is, I mean, the best known example is obviously GFC, but, and then, even there were questions after COVID, and I guess, then when we originally started writing this paper, that seemed to be one of the issues. So there's an FSB report, oh, now COVID will be end up on a lower level. I guess now we have most countries gone back to trend, so that may not be so relevant. And there's obviously a lot of, or there's growing evidence of this. There's a paper by Chera just sort of surveying this year. Now, but there's very little on sort of a deeper understanding what drives scarring, where does it come from? And this is sort of a general phenomenon or not. And clearly, this is a really important question for a policymaker, because ultimately, the macro model says that each shock, you're going to recover to trend. So if that's not the case, then your policy will be different. You should have different policies, and I'm going to talk later about this. Now, it's also a question: is it sort of driven by the shock? So we know the scarring is sort of after the financial crisis. And, Alan sits in the room, so clearly he's done a lot of work on this. But is it dependent on the shock or not? Is that does it occur from other big events as well? And then there's also a question which is related to when you think about the unit root literature. Yes, you would have permanent effects, but they would be for positive shocks, for negative shocks, or independent where you are. And as I said, the same one. Now, what we're going to do, and this is sort of, I guess, we will differ from what's currently out there in the literature. We're going to do a very simple. I should actually go to here. We're going to do a very simple statistical intuitive test to detect scarring in the data, and we do this on the properties of long run growth. And then and I'll tell you exactly what we do. So we're going to apply this to a sample of 24 countries from 1970 to now. They are mostly advanced economies, but we have a few EMEs in there as well. And what we're going to show is that very deep contractions. So these are the sort of the worst, and actually the ultimate, when we're going to look at the worst 1 year drops in growth rates, they have highly persistent effects. So you're not going to recover back to the trend, but they will be lower. Once we go for less severe contractions, you don't see any permanent scarring. It's really the size that matters, it's not the course. So as I said before, we know this basically already for a financial crisis, but we find exactly the same effects for when you have what we label monetary policy tightenings or oil price shocks. And the literature, I already touched about this. So where do we differ? There's obviously this very long unit root literature, and for those who know Mikael Juselius, he has been working, he's in this, and sort of, there the real issue is obviously it's very hard to detect, and I guess it's still not settled, and this is the symmetry. So if you have a unit root, if you go permanent shock up or down, this will always be there. Then many other papers have been sort of looking at GDP movements around specific events. Again, sort of, take financial crisis, or the Saxena paper, the 2008, they have financial crisis, they have sort of big events, and then you say, look, do I recover or not? And then there's sort of 2-3 papers out there who look at the, is that shift in trend output or not? But again, you look at around events like the Blanchard piece is like around the GFC. And our idea, and this is really what I said, is very simple. So think about a world where you grow whatever permanently, this is sort of your trend, then there's a very deep shock. If there's no scarring, you're going to recover to trend at some point. And what our some point, sort of, this is sort of how we're going to define it, but we'll say after 10 years, we assume, if there's no scarring, it should recover back to trend. Okay, so whilst initially if you take a 1 year horizon in the log level of GDP jumping down, yes, there should be a big effect. That should be much worse compared to other time series in the literature. But after a really while, sort of this thing should be the same 10-year growth rate than in the average sample any otherwise. Now, if you have scarring, what's going to happen? You have the big shock, but you're not going to recover. So this 10-year growth rate will be lower than the average 10-year growth rate in the sample. And that's, so we have very simple, this is super simple, so we can test this, we take all these, we identify deep shocks, then we take the 10-year growth rate, and then we compare whether on average that's lower than the average 10-year growth rate at any other point in the sample. Clearly, there's a couple of questions. So how do I identify these T-zeros? So what people did before, that's sort of a narrative approach. So you'd say there's financial crisis in this quarter. We're going to take an agnostic approach. So we're going to say, we basically look at GDP growth, and we cut up percentiles in the total distribution and say, you have the worst 5% percentiles, then you have 10% and so forth. And then that gives us the severity of the shock. No, shock is actually the wrong word, the severity of the event. Now, clearly there's also like what is long enough, because clearly if you go very long run, we should recover. Basically you can think about this, whatever. This is the shock is D, and then whatever, this is 1/10 of D still remaining after 10 years. So if you go out to whatever 100, that shock will be super small in the long run. Now, again, this is sort of arbitrary. We're going to show you one picture, and we actually look at it from 1 to 50 years. Now, there's a couple of issues which crop up, and I'm sure they already popped up in your mind. One issue is, which goes back sort of to work, which was also Blanchard looking at, like many of these events, and we know this, is like you had a boom ahead of the bust. So the typical credit boom bust cycle. So you have a crusade. So then you would think, I don't know, what you're actually picking up is not the drop, but that there was the boom, and then after 10 years this growth period is longer. But that's just reverting back to the trend. So I'm going to show you two robustness checks where we control this, and we can actually follow Blanchard, where we say, look, we can actually start basically 2-3 years earlier. That's what they do. So to exclude the boom period.
Sorry, could you just say once what the red and the blue lines are?
Okay, sorry. Maybe I'll go back to it's easier. So we are looking at the blue lines, essentially. Yeah, I haven't shown you the orange line, but I can also look. But the blue line is simply growth rates across different horizons. And what we're going to do, we take the 10-year growth rate from T0, and then compare at T0, like the 10-year ahead growth rate from T0, and then compare that on it with the average growth rate in the sample. Now, one of the things, and this is the orange line, which is actually one of the other issues, is to say, okay, obviously, this 10-year growth rate is actually also lower. If you, in the run-up to this event, this will pick up sort of, part of the permanent drop, and it's actually not related. So what we do in our main paper, we actually we actually leave them in the sample, because if you drop 10-year growth rates, a lot of 10-year growth rates, you actually end up with that little information. So we compare basically the 10-year growth rates of T0 with everything else in the sample, and that includes these orange lines. So that actually makes our test weaker. We have a control where we actually drop all those run-ups to the T0s, so that we drop these orange lines.
So the blue line is 10-year growth rate forward from the
T0
or a big shock.
From the T, yes, exactly. From the T0, exactly. Now the other, exactly. So this is sort of things which go, our test may get slightly screwed up, sort of. The other thing is, and that's a big problem, and I'm sure I'm going to get lots of comments on it. Now, if you look, we go from 1970 to now, there's obviously a massive growth slowdown. So this will, in some sense, if you look 10 years ahead, a growth slowdown, 10 years ahead will actually bias us to find scarring, but clearly it will also depress the average growth rate to, from the, outside the sample of T0, which sort of biases us against finding scarring. Now, we do a lot of tests in trying to detrend this, and I tell them in a second. So, and I'm sure, actually, we are convinced that we need to do our baseline results with a different method, but you're going to get the old paper for the moment. I talked already about the run-up time. Now, and there's also a question where if, we were also going to check for expansions. And if you think about it, you could actually find that expansion could have permanent effects simply because, if you think about we compare, if you include these deep contractions, then you have sort of one, the alternative is this, you have two distributions and one is very far to the right, including the expansions, the normal period. So, but we'll do a two-sided test for that. That plot is correct, right?
That plot is correct.
Very good. So what do we have? We have re-GDP series seasonally. They are actually seasonally adjusted. They're quarterly from 1970 to 2019. Actually, we also have the COVID period included as robustus. 24 countries with 5 EMEs. Then, as I said before, what are we going to do? We take the 8 quarter ahead real growth rate, and actually, and that's basically what we had. Now, this is the key crux. So this is for removing the low frequency, slow moving trend. So what we're going to take is an HP filter with this very large lambda, 400,000, which is roughly a linear trend. There's a lot of work in the BS where we've used it for credit gaps, and I've done a lot of work with this, and I think this is why we ended up with this. But I know that all the academics hate an HP filter with 400,000, so you're going to have your issues with it. But we, as I said before,
I love it.
You love it? Okay, let's keep it as a baseline. Yeah, but I think this is we'll show you a slide where we do. So we find it in the raw data. We can do a Hamilton filter. The problem is that many of the trends, obviously, we're going to do 10-year ahead growth rates. If I do like a more standard HP filter with 1,600, all what I'm going to get is like I'm going to actually remove what I'm most interested in. So I need these long horizons. As I said before, we're going to then, so we have the detrended data, we do the growth rate. Then we're going to look at, we take the distribution and then actually, we take and do the percentile. And what I should say, we actually look at, because we have the cross-country sample, we're going to actually normalize them by means and standard deviation. And then we chop off like the 5th percentile, 5th to 10th, and so forth. And this is the severity of the recession. And as I said before, it's very simple. So we're going to compare the 10-year growth rates at T0s vis-a-vis all the other 10-year growth rates in the sample. And then we bootstrap our standard errors and account for cross-correlation in this Politis and Romano paper formula. And actually, before I show the results, I actually show you, to make it really clear what we're doing, I show you the raw data. So this is the log level of GDP in the US. We start 1970. These red dots are what we identify as the most severe T0s. So obviously around the GFC, but we have also some T0s here. This graph shows you basically what we're doing. So I'm going to normalize all these T0s on my 0. You see you have run up in GDP, you have this drop, and then whatever, it bumbles. It doesn't really, already visually you see it's not recovering. And here it's simply the 10-year growth. These are the growth rates at T0. So this is the 10-year growth rate at T0. That's the 5-year growth rate. And you see, there's basically seems to drop down a bit already. And then, very deep. Obviously, this is by definition, they're the worst contractions in the sample. There's some recovery, but it doesn't recover to the long run average, which is the red line. And that's basically already evident also if I aggregate all across all countries, it's the same picture. I have the, log level of GDP goes up, I have T0, by definition, very severe. And then I have this sort of step change down.
One part of clarification is the point that it's not that it just doesn't return to the red line, it doesn't overshoot to bring it back to the pre-trend.
Correct. Yeah, but after 10 years, so this is the 10-year growth rate, Alan. So it should go back to the 10-year growth rate. This is I should have said, this is the 10-year growth rate on average outside the sample out of the window.
Well, that's not annual growth, that's...
This red line is the average 10-year growth, right? So in terms of you would expect that the blue line is the growth rate from T0 to here. From T0 to here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So here it's annual growth, and here's whatever 5-year growth, and here it's 10-year growth. And in some sense, what I'm going to do, I'm going to test the blue line vis-a-vis the red line.
Okay.
That's basically all what we're doing, or to be more precise in the sample, again, the blue line is in the panel.
Okay.
And that's it. That's the result. I mean, given I show you the raw data, it's it's not that surprising that yes, at these very severe recessions on the 5th percentile or the lower 5th percentile, we see that yes, they are basically roughly 1 standard deviation below for the 10-year growth rate. So if you translate this, you're going to get a sort of a loss in the level of GDP of around close to 5%. So what are you going to see? You're going to see actually that the less severe the recession is, there's no scarring. So essentially, after the 20th percentile, you don't see any scarring anymore. So it's really these very, very severe shocks which are going to drive what we see. So then, once I have a severe shock, I get scarring. Now, the question then was sort of, does it matter on what the cause is? And we're not going to talk about shocks, but it's really, so that's why we say it's the proximity cause. So we're going to split the sample first into crisis, non-crisis, which is very easy because we have obviously all these papers who do crisis dating. And then we say, basically, if we find one of our T0s, and it doesn't, then whatever, Leiden and Valencia date the crisis in whatever that quarter, and then whatever late 1 quarter before or 2 quarters later, we have a drop. So we say this is crisis related. And then obviously the others are not. But the others, we also actually, for the 5th percentile, I'm actually only looking at the 5th percentile, so now to be quicker. We then did sort of basically go through and looked at them. So you can actually identify relatively easy where the oil price shocks. And then David Aikman actually went through and looked at when there was really rapid rises in interest rates. So we associate this with monetary policy. You can actually, they fit the dates. I mean, Blinder had a recent paper where he looked at, all these other recessions that are driven by monetary policy.
This tightening also had a cost, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is why it's proximity cost, because you can say the GFC was also preceded by a tightening. So, yeah, but just to show, so if you do the crisis, non-crisis sample, what you actually see, the permanent drop is really severe after non-crisis event, and it's much more severe than crisis. And actually, I should have said to you, this is the split. So this is where our events are. These are the crisis, and these are monetary policy, and green is oil price shocks. And if you split them up, what you see actually the biggest scarring happened after the oil price shocks. So what we labeled monetary policy related is actually sort of less severe, but we can't separate them. Given I now have 5 more minutes, and actually, sort of this is an interesting graph. So here, this is the very well-known annual GDP growth, left skewed, and this is our sample. So this is the 5th percentile. You can actually see the permanent drop in the 10-year this distribution, because it's essentially bimodal. So this is the low growth mode, and this is sort of the normal distribution. And these modes are statistically different. You can actually test them, and they're indeed statistically different. Now, there is actually little sort of, if you would think about a Markov switching model, you would drop down to lower, you drop up, you would actually get a jump up. And in some cases, we find this, but this is actually not significant. And actually, this bimodality starts to emerge, from the 5th year onwards, you see these, and 7 years, beautiful, 2 modes, and then 10 years as well. Just to make, we said before, we will also look at, is this now, do we have permanent effect for contractions or expansions? And the problem is really like, the standard test may give me a wrong idea. So what I'm going to do to ensure that if I have an expansion, which I again define as the top 5 percentile, but now on the right hand side of the distribution, I'm going to drop left percentile so that these very severe contractions don't drive me down what is normal and what is the average growth rate outside expansion. That's what we call a two-sided test. And just to show you, because this is because if you don't do this, it seems that they actually have permanent effect, but they disappear once they are driven because I have these very severe contractions at the bottom. And indeed, if you look at it, I'm tracking. These are the expansions, and I'm tracking them over the 10-year time. And actually, they are sort of pretty much centered around 0. And actually, when I go back to if you take about those guys, they still remain in the very left of the distribution. Okay, so in my last 2 minutes, we do a lot of robustness checks. So this was the detrending. So there's no detrending. There's a Hamilton filter with 20 years. We do rolling averages. We actually remove population growth. Results remain the same. Deep drop significant. Once you return to sort of less severe, you don't get scarring. We do sample splits. It's basically also countries which didn't have a crisis, so Australia. And again, you see exactly the same thing. You have the very deep contractions have scarring effects, but the mild ones don't. This was the time, by definition, these are very severe events over the 1 year horizon. Once you reach year 7, it's roughly flat, the scarring effect, and then we do 50 years, but then the sample becomes very tight. And again, we do different, how do you define? We say, look, this is quarterly, you can do many things, so it's totally robust. And it's actually also at the country level. So, here we have real problem. We have 10 years of growth rates. There are a couple of outliers where it's not significant. But yeah, so the US is sort of not really, but most countries, you see that there are permanent drops. And the question then is, so what does it actually mean? So if there's scarring in the long run, that clearly has implications, and this is sort of what I said before. First of all, actually, the standard ESG models are not correct, because they would converge back to trend, and we find that for very severe shock, that's not the case. Equally, if you have an homogeneous growth model, those are typically symmetric, and we don't find symmetry. So what you really need, and this speaks to, I guess, macro models which have, occasionally binding financial constraints and financial frictions, but many of them actually don't have scarring as well, because you jump back up. So really, you need to, I guess, sort of there's a paper by Alto where financial constraints and endogenous growth, and that would be sort of what we would see consistent with what we find. Also, the paper of the debt trap by me and co-authors is really sort of seems to consistent with what we find in the data. And as a good policymaker, I have obviously policy implications, but I think the key one is really sort of, again, it's a Blanchard point to say, look, you do not want to end up that I have these very big severe shocks. So that's where I need to avoid them. If you think a bit more about day-to-day policy making, it's really, once we had a severe shock, assuming that you revert back to trend, will give you misleading policy signals. And now I get the red card, and I'm done.
Good. Okay, let's open it up. Some questions.
An obvious comment, and just a comment, is that whether you get in that bottom 10% is unbelievably dependent on the policy response. And COVID is, I know you didn't show the results including COVID, but let's be blunt, we are where we are because globally they threw the kitchen sink at it. I mean, so the COVID overdid it, obviously, frankly, all the things about inflation, but from a growth perspective.
And I can't even test it. I don't even yet have 10 years.
Of course not.
So, yeah,
it was nice what I said. It's an observation,
No.
not a criticism. You mentioned Markov switching it when I thought, no, I'm going to do it. It's all started out actually. I'm old school, I realize. And that's incredibly arbitrary, but kind of modeling. But did you do anything with that? I know you mentioned it in passing.
So Markov switching should be giving me 3 modes.
Yeah.
Because I jump down, I stay down, and then I may jump back up.
Yeah.
And then I should actually find tri-modality, because the jump up should be actually,
Yes.
and that's what we don't find. I mean,
we don't find that. Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
I was just wondering how many long expansions you even have in the sample. So talking about whether or not hysteresis may also possible in the other side. I mean, one example of which I was also thinking about is, for instance, the Euro area double dip recession. How do you treat that? Because I mean, with your 10 years window, you will not see any recovery in the first place. And the thing is, with recessions, they're clearly identified. Upswings are harder in that sense. So the double dip. At some point, we actually only say, look, we have this double dip problem, so let's look only at the first as one, just statistically, because we obviously, we might hit this step down. So we have only one dip, and that the results go through. Now, the expansions, I'm just being agnostic. So I can look at my GDP distribution. I take the 5% tail, the 5% right-hand tail now, and say, look, what happens at these T-zeros? Yeah, I define that is in some sense easy.
But and they you don't find, and there it seems that you don't find that they have permanent effects, which would be exactly if you have endogenous growth, like a positive, productivity shock, you should actually be boosted and you should be higher. But that's not
But
what you're
if the
saying.
next shock comes, you can never have such a long session.
You mean the expansions are never long enough? But that's what a standard model would tell me. But they should be, equally for the deep recession, shouldn't I be popping up again? There shouldn't be some positive shocks coming after 3, 4, 5 years.
Recovery and another shock comes, I cannot have this.
Okay, no, that's true.
Yeah, well, using shares prerogative and that's good. I'll ask one unfair question. I know it's unfair because people always ask it about our papers, which is, especially here, it's 1970s are a big body of stories. So, do you have end shocks or is it one shock? So, can you put this in a context where there's a global trend, global shocks, and people might worry about like the inference. Are we really seeing end observations, or are we seeing just?
Okay, we threw in time fixed effects.
Yeah.
It remains robust.
Okay. Good answer. It looks even more.
It does look stronger, yes, exactly. But
Would that make it better?
Yeah, but I guess you actually have more scarring and then since that's for sure. Maybe it's better. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean maybe that should be our baseline. It's good.
Yeah.
Anyway, the other question is what models can deliver that kind of asymmetry? I mean, maybe we'll hear about this later, but you've mentioned occasionally binding constraints, but what about another example would be the downward rigidity, the downward dominant wage rigidity. So when the economy gets hit with a contractionary shock, prices can adjust immediately. I think we've done that in our paper, and it's now shut it on appendix, but it's another option.
Okay. And that gives me the one-sidedness as well.
Yeah.
I think we are agnostic. Yeah. No, that's good.
Okay, one more.
Yeah, you told at the beginning that you are rethinking the methodology. You are now thinking of a different approach that we are presenting the old version of the paper.
No, I'm detrending because the HP filter always gets comments.
Okay,
This is the only thing we're going to change.
Yeah, okay.
So we actually want to change it to basically GDP per capita. That seems to be, and then basically take that as the baseline without detrending anything, and then throw the whole detrending story at it with all different things.
Okay, thank you.
Do you really have to? Because what if the scarring shows up as a very persistent fall in GDP growth? Then you're kind of throwing out the interesting variation by.
You mean you should not? We should start with the. Yeah, I mean the one story where I think it's sort of economic meaningful to trend is GDP per capita. That's why we thought this is going to be our baseline in the sense take GDP per capita in levels, and then because clearly there is a downward trend, and you could say is that scarring or not? Maybe you're right. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. Sort of we got the detrending always, so yeah.
For including the paper into the program. So before I get started, like the views are strictly our own and not necessarily the ones of our employers. So basically to start with the motivation, I think after the first talk and the general theme of the session, we don't really need much motivation introduction, but like we're basically interested in 3 major questions in this context. Like first of all, do firms adjust their investment in innovation in response to a recession? Because if they do, we have reason to think that cyclical movements in the economy, in particular recession, translates into what we typically think is the main driver of long-run growth, investment in innovation. And through that, we would see an interaction between cycle and trend in this setting. And through that, we should also think of that long-run effect, that recessions are going to have long-run effects in such an environment. And in this context, we are also interested in the question what specific shocks and frictions play at the firm level. And in general, when thinking about the empirical evidence on these issues, we particularly look into time series evidence and so on, but we have very scarce evidence at the firm level. And this is basically what this paper does. We present firm-level empirical evidence on the adjustment of investment in innovation, which we have along various dimensions. in a crisis, specifically during the COVID-19 episode and for Germany. And we connected to hysteresis effects and TFP. So I'm mainly focusing on the data in this presentation, because we have a large firm-level data set with granular and unique joint information on many variables, and most importantly, the adjustment of investment in innovation, the actual realized investment in innovation versus the pre-crisis plans. And we also have the production decrease due to the crisis. So not just any production decrease, but really that which can be attributed to the cyclical change in the economy. And in addition to that, we have the reasons for adjustment. We have the expectations at the firm level for both their own economic outlook and the macroeconomic outlook, and alongside various firm level frictions, including also the role of government support that the firms receive. And we also have a theoretical part of the model, but this is a smaller part compared to the data, and in which we have a medium scale ESG model with endogenous technology growth, and that model we predominantly use for macroeconomic dynamics and working out the long run TFP effects and the long run effects of a recession, and predominantly to use it for scenario analysis in this context to work out different recession scenarios, because we have the data for the specific crisis episodes, but we can work with the assumptions and see how this affects the long run effects in this context. And yeah, so to go right away to the results. So what we see in this data set is that we observe a downward adjustment of innovation investment by firms in response to the crisis. So in terms of the share of the firms, it's about 25% of firms which invest in R&D, and about 20% of firms with technology adoption plans. And with R&D and technology adoption, I basically mean the distinction. R&D is directed at frontier innovation, and technology adoption investment covers everything else, which is not meant for R&D, and it's not covered, not meant at generating a patent, for instance. And we see that these cuts that firms undertake are large and economically substantial, meaningful in that sense, on average, like 750,000 euros in R&D, or about 950,000 for adoption activities. And with this data set, we generate a measure of innovation investment of the innovation investment response due to crisis-induced output drop. So in which we link the crisis-induced output drop to the probability to decrease investment in R&D and adoption. And we see that if a firm observes production decrease or decrease in business activity due to a recession, it's 50% more likely to decrease its investment in R&D, and about 40% for the adoption margin. And we also have this measure in a continuous way, and there we can see that a 1 percentage point fall in output at the firm level induced by the crisis results in a cut of R&D and adoption activities by respectively 0.6 percentage points. And yeah, so as to the drivers of adjustment, we have macroeconomic shocks, various, so we basically have various information on the underlying macroeconomic shocks, and you can also disentangle shocks versus structural drivers here. And the most important shocks in this context are uncertainty, which is not surprising in the context of a major recession, COVID restrictions, and importantly, like from the angle of this paper, also a fall in demand at the firm level. And this is important for also macroeconomic policy, because it also shows some direction in that we have reason to think that a cyclical fall in demand also translates into long run growth effects, and through that has long run effects also from that angle. And as to the main driving shocks, we see a synchronized pattern of R&D and technology adoption activities, which means that it's the same drivers behind the adjustment and R&D and technology adoption, as is typically also the case in the models which work out these effects. And we also explored the information and expectations about firms' expectations about the future. And here we see that, like, in particularly also the role of future demand is important in the setting, because like if firms expect future demand problems, let's say within the next 6 months, they are 35% more likely to decrease their R&D investment and about 30% for adoption activities. Now, in our sample, as you see in the decomposition of the shocks that I'm mentioning here, financial shocks are not important for that specific crisis episode, but this is, as we were mentioning already a little bit in the previous discussion, also a reflection of the fiscal policy measures and also in general financial policies which were implemented at that time, and especially also in Germany, because they went directly to the firm level and also directly targeted to firms which were affected by the crisis, and in a matter of just a couple of months in the end. So direct emergency assistance to the firm level. So it's not surprising that firms do not report financial constraints. Is important because they simply were not at that time. However, we still see the role of financial frictions in the expectations about the future, because if in case firms see problems with financing, they're also about like 30% more likely to decrease their R&D investment. So the role of financial frictions is there, but it's not there for that specific crisis. And this is also what leads us to think that the estimates that we are presenting here are conservative in the sense that of magnitude and the strength of this cut in general in a crisis, because as I said, like the fiscal support, like both fiscal monetary stimulus, but also really the measures, the emergency assistance, which went directly to the firm in the form of direct fiscal transfers and also guarantees, financial guarantees, were sizable and also immediate. So they cushioned a lot of the form from the firm perspective, basically driving a wedge between aggregate output and the situation perceived at the firm level. And as we see from the data set, financial constraints were not binding at the time. And in general, like the crisis was expected to be short-lived. So it was very different in that sense to the financial crisis, for instance, in which perhaps, especially due to a long-run orientation of innovation investment, firms were inclined to maybe smooth out the decline more strongly. Now, as to the data, so it's a large representative sample of firms, representative of across sector and size categories, meaning it's not just manufacturing firms, but really the whole population of firms. And this is important also thinking of non-frontier innovation, because this is particularly important for smaller firms. And it's the Bundesbank online panel firms, which is a regular survey conducted by Bundesbank, but we had the chance to insert our specific research questions in terms of for the innovation investment, the special innovation group fielded in 2021, the third quarter. We have 5,500 firms through that. And we have the granular information and in particular also the joint information on all of these variables, which is typically not the case. So so we have information on frontier innovation and non-frontier innovation. I said that already, but we also have planned versus actual investment, which means we had the plans that firms had at the end of 2019 for 2020 versus the actual undertaking investment in the course of 2020. So we have the plans, we have the actual investment, and through that we can identify also the change.
Sorry, so once again, so you have the 2019 plan and the 2020 executed.
Yes.
But not like say the 2021, how much they did, like did you follow them over time some more? Or?
We did not, but we have like some measure which basically shows whether or not there will be an overshooting afterwards, because I guess that's what you're asking.
Have to close my lab because of COVID, but then next year I'm going to run it extra hard.
Yes, no, so we have that for the aggregate basically in the end, so I can talk about it a bit more towards the end. And and then we have the cyclical drop in production of business activity depending on in which sector you're at. And then the reasons for adjustment of investment in technology, in which we can also decompose cyclical versus structural reasons, because not all of the adjustment may be due to structural changes, to cyclical changes, and as well as a set of different shocks in this context. And the role of expectation that the firm level both about their own situation and about the future, Then further level financial frictions financially, and also the government support measures that they received, and also the history of these financial frictions in that sense. And as well as a general set of firm controls. And so again, like the coverage is basically across the entire firm distribution. And yeah, as to the direction of change, so I will explain most of the tables by means of R&D, and then just quickly comment on how it differs from for technology adoption investment. So here for R&D, first of all, looking at the second column. So for those that didn't plan R&D, not many started it. So that means the action of adjustment really happens on the extensive margin. So very few firms started with R&D in response to the crisis. Then of those that planned R&D investment, we see that like over 25% decided to decrease, 6%, so the minority of firms increased, and as we will see also in the amounts that they changed were small, whereas the amounts that were decreased were large, leaving us in the aggregate with a big downward adjustment. And I mean, with technology adoption, shares are similar, also with respect to the extensive margin, but a smaller share of firms, which decreased and increased to about 20%, which adjusted their investment downwards. And I mean, for those, we have built in the questionnaire also information on those firms that did not adjust, because it's also important and informative to know what is behind the reasons for non-adjustment. And there we see that 46% of firms did not experience a sufficiently large change, which would have warranted such an adjustment. So they were not sufficiently, you could interpret it as that they were not sufficiently hard hit by the crisis. And then we also have the role of financial resources here, because another like 32%, 33% state that they had enough financial resources, even though their conditions changed, but they had sufficient financial resources to counteract the effect of the crisis without having to adjust investment in innovation. And again, like also like the blue and the red bar here shows that altogether only a small fraction of firms were not able to adjust it in either direction. So this was not really the binding constraint here all in all. And but still, like investment in innovation more generally, and especially R&D, is of course a long-term orientation project, in that sense that if agents expected to be short-lived, they're probably less declined to decrease. And since COVID was perceived as transitory in the sense that it's not the reflection of fundamentals, like for instance in the Great Recession, there's reason to assume that this played a role here as well. And then as to the magnitude of R&D investment, so first of all, like we see here in terms of the plans, that they're of course heterogeneous, as you would expect from just thinking about R&D and the distribution of firms more generally. And we see that on average, the decrease was about 750,000 euros in response to the crisis in the first year in any case. And also the average increase of the small, remember it's not just a small share which increased, but also the average amount of these decreases was small, which leaves us on balance clearly with a negative amount. And this pro-cyclical adjustment here, we do another split basically between core innovators, those that regularly invest in R&D, and also with a budget, without a budget, that invest regularly in R&D. That there, the pro-cyclical adjustment is even stronger. So you see that this is really also a margin that those firms that are important for research and development and the aggregate also use this margin of adjustment. And for technology adoption, similar patterns all in all, but a stronger adjustment in terms of mean adjustment in this, which we have here about 950,000. So, and this is kind of perhaps also a reflection that R&D is generally related to budgeting and all these types of considerations, whereas like whether or not more long-term oriented, because it's in the end my own project that I'm working on, And I'm expecting to have a measurable outcome of it in the future, whereas technology adoption activities, whether or not I invest in buying a specific software, whatever it may be, is easier to adjust and also has fewer long-run consequences. And as a result, firms are probably more flexible on this margin as well. And as to the questionnaire, so as to the reasons for change in investment, so we first of all allow also firms to respond in a way that they can clearly state this is not a cyclical shock that they're responding to. So it's another reason not linked to the crisis, for instance. So this is here. And then we also give them a set of options they can choose what was important for their adjustment, and they can also pick multiple reasons here. And which we call now here macroeconomic shocks, but we obviously don't call it like that in the questionnaire because it's a firm survey all in all. And the reasons we give them is uncertainty, demand, access to financing alongside other potential obstacles at the firm level, access to intermediate inputs and so on. And in particular, closures or work restriction due to the COVID pandemic, because this may be important in particular in the context of this crisis. Now, and and here we have the reasons for downward adjustment, and here on the left-hand side for R&D, and here on the right-hand side for technology adoption. And first of all, like one observation here is that, as I said before already, the picture looks similar for R&D and technology adoption, meaning that it's similar driving shocks which are behind that. I mean, in the sense that whether or not how many firms adjust, how strongly they adjust is different, but it's really the similar driving shocks behind both margins of investment. And as a key reason for the adjustment in both emerges economic uncertainty, which is not surprising because this is a long-run investment, and of course the COVID recession has also been characterized by a large-scale increase of uncertainty. And another important reason were the corona restrictions, and with corona restrictions, we specified that it's the policy restrictions which were in place, like lockdowns, hygiene rules, and which were partially very restrictive in Germany. At the moment, we're also working out this more by exploiting the regional variation along these lines. But, and as you see here, like these obstacles posed by policy for containing the pandemic and so on actually lead to a downward adjustment in both innovation margins, and not as, for instance, expected in the beginning of the crisis that it would trigger firms to innovate themselves out of the crisis. On the contrary, at least based on our sample. Then, lastly, as you can see here in the blue bar here, about 50% of firms investing in adoption and R&D, which made an adjustment, perceived the drop in demand as important in their adjustment. And from that angle, given that typically in standard macroeconomic models, and we rule out basically the cyclical fluctuations in demand can spill over to the long run aggregate supply side. This is particularly interesting in our view, because it seems that cyclical shifts in demand do have an implication for long-run growth investments, and through that for the trend path. And lastly, here we basically explored the impact of the recession, of the production decrease due to the recession, and we study its role for the probability to decrease investment. Here we show it for research and development, but it's similar for technology adoption, as we work out more in the paper as well. And we observed that here, with and without firm controls, basically our result is robust in the end. And if firms perceive decrease in production due to the recession, their probability to decrease investment in R&D increases by 50%. Or then in terms of the measure which we also have in percentage, so the percentage decline in production due to the recession, 1 percentage point drop translates in 0.6 increase in the probability to decrease investment. So this is clearly there. And again, this is really also the production decrease due to the crisis. So it's not just some random shift basically in the sense, but we can get this information from the questionnaire. And then about the role of expectations about the future. Again, what we see here is the role of demand also from that angle, because if firms expect a problem with demand over the next 6 months, their probability to decrease investment in R&D goes up by about 40%. And here, even though we do not see that, again, like going back to the reasons actually, like financing frictions, access to finance is here. So only like 0.1 or 0.2 all in all of the firms, so 20 to 10%, depending on which margin you look at, perceived access to finance as a constraint in that sample. But here through the expectations, we actually do see that if firms expect problems of financing in the future, they're much more likely also to cut down their research and development investment. And about COVID restrictions in itself, here you can see like that the expectations about them do not really are not significant in that setting. So it was not like it was perceived as a temporary problem. You could see it that way, but not necessarily as a longer lasting one. And again, like the similar results also for adoption. And coming back to your question earlier, whether or not the firms actually overshoot subsequently. So as you can see here, it's actual investment in blue versus plan. So first of all, we see that it's that they tightly co-move over time. So it's not, there are no systemic downward revisions as such. But then the gap is really during the crisis time. And as you can see, even like the planned investment in innovation goes down afterwards. So this is, and we don't have these observations yet, but it's a more sustained decrease also from that angle. And also at least to that extent, what we have, we do not see an overshooting during the investment that fell during that time. And yeah, so we have a theory analysis, which we mainly use for scenario analysis and working on longer run TFP effects and so on, but I'm running out of time. So it's time for me to conclude. So we have like the Firmlevel evidence basically from the most recent recession for Germany that firms can cut investment in innovation in response to recession. They are economically substantial cuts as well. We see also the Firmlevel evidence for spillovers from short run demand to long run aggregate supply, and both in the direct reasons and the expectations about the future. And we do view what we show in this data set as a conservative estimate of the adjustment due to the policy support which was in place and also due to the specific nature of the crisis, basically. And with respect to the implications for macro modeling and policy, we think of that stabilization policies matter, especially also demand stabilizing policies in terms of the long-run cost of recession, and more strictly thinking of the role between cycle and trend. And to what extent there are distinct concepts. We do view that this is a direct evidence also for cycle trend interaction, and which kind of casts doubt also on the role of potential output and gap measures in that angle. Yes, thanks.
And
Can I ask a question about, could you break these out by industry, your results? Do you have an update by industry?
By industry, so we at the moment we're working on heterogeneity analysis, which works out the sectoral role in the setting as well. But like at least what we can see here as well. So we have it without firm and without basically firm controls and with firm controls here. So this is the role of the sectors that accounted for here and then. But we see that the difference is not too large, and we attribute this also to the policy measures which were implemented.
So the reason I asked the question is because I'm the R&D numbers make complete sense. The technology adoption, though, I guess it depends on how it comes to measure it. But all I can think of is the firms, at least in the United States, went crazy adopting new technology during COVID. I mean, crazy. They invested massive amounts in telecommunications, in security, in IT, in computers. Now, not in every industry, not manufacturing so much, but I was thinking in the services and technology industries. That they literally exploded because everybody went and worked from home. And so that may not be measured in here, but that was the reason I asked.
It's measured here as well. I mean, we did see that some firms basically increased as well. And this is, I mean, we can, for instance, we have here, it's a small number of firms in the end, and we also, it may have also been a part of expenditure switching within the technology adoption thing, for instance, towards more digital technologies. That's one option. You even have like this information in the survey as well, but we didn't want to overwhelm this paper with too much information here, but we could actually go back and check because we also asked about that margin. But if you see here about those which increased actually, even though they're small, right? And also the amounts they increased were small. Here, actually, the COVID restrictions for this small, it's very important for the increase in that sense. So there's some degree of asymmetry here, and in the end, that there may be for some firms there may have been exactly the small difference there as well. Thank you.
I like everything. I like your comments. They are my colleagues. I would be a little bit more cautious in terms of implementation because COVID was special. It was not a standard business cycle thing. And whether this is a long run effect or not, we just don't know. I would wait a little longer. The dip at the end, this graphic showed there was this increase afterwards. So the integral over these two curves might just be similar.
Two things on that. First of all, we have the model to work out the long run effect. So we
The model is what you're gonna put in this.
Yeah. But there's the C, you are aware of the CEBRA, for instance, like there's a recent paper by that as well that documents in a much more detailed way, more from an innovation firm level type of story, not Hysteresis, that the innovation investment in Germany is really on decline since the crisis. So this is not just our story, but it's also consistent with other papers along these lines. And this is the trend. This is where we are. So it remains clearly below. And also, I mean, we don't have
the expectation go down. So you would expect actually the blue line to follow the red line, but it does not because it seems to be taking up this.
No, but this is this is in real time. This is for 2022. What they expect. This is what they say that they plan for 2022. So we adjust this basically over time. It's not a one-time stock taking. So this is basically updated every year here. So they're a little bit above the plans that they had, but this is the new data coming in from last year, and it says that this is what they expect to plan. Basically,
investment is increased in 21. What is this? Where's the expectation for this year?
Here.
Okay.
Yeah.
But in general, like the evidence you present here, maybe other papers show that, but here right now, I would be cautious saying already I know that this is going to be super long run or it might bounce back, at least with this evidence I've seen.
What we are trying to say here is that the cyclical drop had an implication for the long run investment in innovation, and we can show this. Whether or not this will now overshoot in the future for other reasons doesn't matter that much for our story, because I mean the current situation in Germany is overlaid by so many other things, like also thinking of the energy crisis and all types of innovation along these lines. So of course we're cautious here, I get your point, but our point is that the cyclical drop had implications for that. And this is what we can show from that.
All right, so thanks very much. So this is a paper about, well, really about the long run effects of income tax cuts. So the question we're after is this here. So what are the long run effects of corporate and personal income tax cuts? And we're going to focus on the effects on innovation and on aggregate productivity. And more particularly, so spoiler alert, we're going to find kind of large effects. And so what are the channels with which those effects operate? Okay, and so the first thing is we're going to present some new evidence on the kind of longer term effects of these tax shocks. I'll describe a little bit about how we identify it. And what we find is that the kind of tax cut we observe in the data for corporate tax cuts, we see this large and persistent rises in GDP and productivity and in research and development. For personal tax cut, we see quite large, but relatively transitory increases in GDP and productivity. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a model to these data. We're going to estimate an endogenous growth model. I said really semi-endogenous growth model. I'll say what that matters, which is going to have some features of the tax code. And what we learned from that is really what it looks like is that R&D and technology adoption, or we call it applied research here, really drives the persistence of the responses to the corporate income tax shock. Why? Well, so cutting corporate income taxes increases the value of intellectual property in the economy, and that's going to provide incentives for innovators to create new technologies. For personal income taxes, right, there's good reason to think that cuts in personal income taxes should increase innovation, essentially through a labor supply channel. Axelrod and co-authors of the paper that shows something like that. In our data, that channel is going to be comparatively small, but present. Okay, so to summarize, I guess corporate taxes are going to have these really large and persistent effects on GDP. And specifically, that's going to come through productivity. Okay, so we want to understand why. And what the model is going to tell us is that's all because of these corporate taxes having effects on R&D and technology adoption. That's going to propagate the effects long into the future. Okay, so very quickly on the empirics. So the tax changes we use, this is straight out of Romer and Romer. Okay, so Romer and Romer, they identify these episodes that we can think of as being plausibly exogenous, or as plausibly exogenous as possible. Really, this is kind of what we have to look at macro tax changes. Mertens and Rabin split that into personal and corporate taxes and show how to more precisely identify the shocks. Okay, so this we're more or less taking off the shelf. And for the longer term effects, we're using local projections. Okay, so let me show you the results. This is for corporate income taxes. Okay, so let me focus your attention for now on the top left corner. Okay, what this is in response to one of the shocks we observed in the data. This is the response of the corporate tax rate itself. Okay, the red line in the middle, that's the median response. This blue stuff, that's the estimated model. I'll say more about that in a second. Okay, but so there's this federal income tax cut. What this red line says is what happens to the actual effective tax rate in the economy in the years following that tax cut. Okay, what you can see is that no matter what the legislation said, and typically legislation, not always, but legislation is going to say this is a permanent cut in taxes. What actually happens to effective tax rates is they mean revert pretty quickly. Okay, so in the end, in terms of actual taxes paid in the economy, the effect of these tax cuts is pretty transitory. Okay, so after maybe 12 quarters, it's essentially gone. Okay, so the kind of tax shocks that we're studying in the data are actually pretty transitory. Okay, which kind of puts a finer point on the question, because the question really becomes, is it the case that even these transitory cuts in taxes can have long-run effects on GDP? Okay, and the answer you can see in these two panels at the top here. This is a response of GDP. Okay, you can see at peak, the median estimate is somewhere around maybe 0.75%, and that lasts way, way longer than the tax cut itself. Okay, so after 32 quarters, we still see a large positive effect. Why does that happen? This is a response of hours, GDP per hour. Okay, just raw labor productivity, and you can see that, you know, after 10 years after this transitory tax cut, labor productivity is still 0.75 percentage point higher than before. Okay, so corporate tax cuts, even though they're really transitory, have this really large persistent effect on labor productivity. Okay, so why might that be? Okay, so here we're unpacking it. I mean, I guess, you know, with your macro hat, you might think, well, this is either about capital accumulation or it's about TFP. Okay, so bottom left panel, a lot of this is going to be about TFP. Okay, this is what's going to motivate us to think about an endogenous growth model. You can see that the response of TFP explains, let's say, most of the responsive labor productivity. And looking at R&D, okay, so quite a persistent response of R&D. Okay, this kind of hump-shaped, pretty persistent response, R&D, and also non-residential investment. Okay, so cut corporate taxes even for a few periods, really large effects of productivity, and it looks like they're coming both from R&D and also from investments. Yeah, so the blue stuff, that's the estimated model. Okay, so it does a pretty good job matching the data. The model is going to be estimated not just to fit this stuff, but also to fit what I'm going to show you next, which is the responses to the personal tax cut, personal income tax cut. Okay, so again, whatever it says in legislation, the actual effect of the personal tax cut on effective tax rates is pretty transitory. Okay, even more transitory than before. The personal tax cut looked like it's gone after about 8 quarters. What's the effect? Okay, so large responsive GDP and large responsive labor productivity, but they look relatively transitory. The TFP also responds a little bit, although also pretty transitory. And R&D really no response, investment, pretty large response, but again, relatively transitory. Okay, so to sort of summarize the evidence, corporate tax cuts, even though they're transitory, really large long-run effects on labor productivity. Personal tax cuts are even more transitory, have large but pretty transitory effects on labor productivity. Okay, so that's the evidence we're going to be working with. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with the model. Okay, so we're going to take this semi-endogenous growth model to the data. So this is a version of the Kominen-Girdler model, this model of R&D and adoption, in which instead of being fully endogenous, it's semi-endogenous. Okay, what that does is, what that means is these transitory shocks won't have literally permanent effects on GDP. Okay, so they might have arbitrarily persistent effects, but not literally permanent effects. Okay, so in that sense, there's no, I mean, if you want to call hysteresis having a long-run effect from a permanent effect from a transitory shock, there's no true hysteresis in this model. But what there is an arbitrarily persistent response of the level of GDP, say, to a transitory shock. Okay, so in that sense, it's kind of, the estimation is going to be conservative in that we're kind of biasing against finding permanent effects from transitory shocks. Okay, we're going to augment the model with some features of the US tax system. Okay, so I didn't know a lot about the US tax system. It turns out, if you believe our model, it's like incredibly important in determining the effects of these tax cuts. Okay, I'm going to show you some. And what I mean is like the really like in the weeds details of the US tax system. Okay, I'm going to thrill you with some of that in a bit. Okay, so what are the features? So one thing that's really important is that, in fact, the cost of producing innovation, you can deduct from your taxes. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, so if I'm a firm, the labor share of R&D is like 90%. Okay, so almost all of R&D is kind of hiring scientists. The cost of hiring scientists, I can deduct directly from my profits, and therefore, the tax, kind of implicitly, the tax system provides a subsidy for that kind of activity. Okay, contrast that to activities, the types of investment that require much more investment in machinery. The cost of machinery is not deductible from my profits, or not fully deductible from my profits. The tax system induces these distortions, and roughly speaking, the tax system favors the production of R&D. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is that when a firm in the US buys intellectual property, okay, so if I go to Alan and I buy a patent from Alan, that I can't fully deduct from my taxes. Okay, so it's, let's say that producing our innovation in-house versus buying innovation from the street is treated very differently in the tax code. Okay, and again, that difference, the model is going to say, is going to be really important in driving the effects of taxation. Okay, so innovation is going to be a two-stage process. There's going to be this R&D stage in which firms sort of come up with kind of new ideas, prototypes, and this applied research or adoption, okay, very broadly conceived, that's when these ideas are going to turn into products. We're going to estimate this model to jointly match the responses to both sets of tax shocks. Okay, the two tax shocks look very, very different than the responses. It's important that the model can speak to both. Okay, because in some sense, it would be very easy for a model to match the responses of one or the other. Matching them jointly turns out to be more difficult. Okay, so how do taxes affect innovation and productivity? Okay, for the corporate tax cut, what that does, okay, the kind of first order effect of a corporate tax cut is that it's going to increase the value of intellectual property. Okay, what do I mean by that? When, if I'm a firm that has a bunch of patents, when you cut my taxes, the value of those patents is going to go up. Okay, kind of the market value of those patents is going to go up. If I'm a very innovative firm and you cut taxes, my stock price jumps. When that happens, that provides me with incentives to create more of that intellectual property. Okay, so more particularly, the value of intellectual property goes up. I want to do more of the kind of innovative activity which delivers cash flows today. Okay, so This applied research margin, that's where I'm turning something that's a prototype into a product that I can launch into market. That stuff has pretty front-loaded cash flows. I get the money kind of today. Okay, so that means that I want to do more of it today. Of course, when I do more of that today, that also raises the value of creating more R&D, of creating more ideas. Okay, and so in equilibrium, I increase the value of intellectual property. That gives me incentive to do more innovation. And as we know, innovation in these models has big spillovers. That's going to further increase the value of intellectual property, and so on. What about the personal tax cut? Okay, it's relatively simple. I cut taxes, so my scientists earn more. They want to supply more labor. Okay, so labor supply and innovation goes up. That increases the returns to applied to R&D and applied research, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just a very little bit on the model. Okay, just to you guys all know this model, but just to kind of fix ideas. So intermediate goods firms, they produce with capital and labor. And there's going to be A of these firms. Okay, so and this A, this is an expanding varieties model. The purpose of applied research of adoption is to increase this A. So as the set of adopted technologies grows, because this data is greater than 1, the economy expands. Okay, just a Romer model. Okay, so aggregate output is the kind of usual stuff. Capital with capital utilization, labor with labor utilization, and then we have this endogenous TFP term that increases when firms carry out applied research. And the stage prior to that, okay, before a firm can do applied research, there must exist this idea, this kind of prototype that can be transformed into applied research. So let me just show you one part of the model, kind of the most important part of the model, which is the R&D problem. Okay, so this is the problem that it's very simple. The problem that innovator J faces in the economy. Okay, so this stuff in here, so X is how many scientists I hire, and W is wages for scientists. So the cost of R&D is how many scientists I'm hiring and their wage. What are the returns to R&D? Well, for each unit, for each scientist hour I hire, this fee here, that's the productivity of R&D. Okay, so I'm going to say that's how many new technologies I got. And what's the value of that? Well, technologies have a price. Patents, let's say, have a price, and that price is going to be PC. Okay, so for the individual innovator, what do they earn in a period? The difference between the value of the technologies they produce and the cost of producing them, and that's going to be taxed at this rate, which is the corporate tax rate. What is this fee? Okay, this is a model with externalities, 2 kinds. The first is that there's a congestion externality. Okay, the more in aggregate, the more scientists are hired, the less effective each scientist is. Okay, so productivity is decreasing in aggregate science labor, and productivity is increasing in the stock of knowledge. Okay, as a standard in this model, but notice that there's a parameter zeta here. That's a number greater than 0. That means that the increase in productivity as the stock of knowledge grows is less than linear. Okay, that's the import of the semi-endogenous growth model. This is a model in which, as the economy grows, ideas are getting harder to find. Okay, so what does the first order condition look like in the aggregate? It looks like this. Okay, so it's kind of straightforward. So we have the wage over price. You can see that if I invert, that's going to tell me how many scientists are hired in the aggregate. Now, if you look at this for a second, the one thing that doesn't show up here at all is taxes, right? So taxes have no direct effect on the decision to innovate. All right, why is that? Well, because I fully deduct the cost of R&D from my profits. You can see that simply in the first order condition, the tax rate drops out. Okay, so the effect of changing the tax rate on innovation must be through these objects. Okay, either the wage changes, etc. Really, what's going on here is the price, the value of a patent is going to change when I change the corporate tax rate. Okay, why is that? Now we're going to talk about the US tax system. Okay, really? Okay, so the US tax system allows what's called straight line amortization for purchased intellectual property. Okay, this is something from very celebrated and influential paper by Haroon Jorgensen. What that means is, what is the price of a patent here? Okay, I'm calling one of these ideas a patent. What is the price of a patent? This J here, that's kind of the fundamental value. That's the cash flows that I derive from owning a patent. In this model, where do those come from? Those come from eventually the fact that one of these new ideas, one of these patents, is eventually going to turn into a product, and I have some monopoly power with that product. I'm going to earn pure profits. That's going to mean that, there's some fundamental value to having this patent. That's not it though, because of the tax code, there's an extra piece to this, which is that in every period, I get to deduct some portion of the cost of purchasing that patent from my profits for tax purposes. That's what amortization means. Okay, so the tax code, depending on how much it allows me to deduct from my taxes in future periods, is going to affect the value of that patent. Okay, so we follow Winbury, who does some stuff like this for kind of a capital investment. Okay, we follow a similar strategy for R&D. And in the end, what we get to is that, the after-tax price of a patent depends, of course, on the fundamental cash flows, but then there's this wedge here, which depends on future corporate taxation and the specific details of the tax code. Okay, so when I change corporate taxes, what happens is I'm going to change the price of a patent. How much the price of a patent changes in response to a change in taxes depends on exactly how the tax system works. Okay, so this is just this wedge which responds to changes in taxes, even if those changes in taxes are transitory. Okay, and this stuff we're all going to take from, we're going to calibrate from data. Yes, okay, that's great. Okay, so let me show you what the model says about why or how labor productivity responds. This is a simple, from the estimator model, this is a simple linear decomposition of labor productivity. The panel on the left is for the corporate income tax cut. The panel on the right is for the personal income tax cut. Okay, so what explains the increase in labor productivity in response to corporate income tax cut? This purple stuff, that's capital utilization. Okay, in the short run, firms utilize capital more heavily when you cut their taxes. What about the long run effect? So I would say this yellow area, that's going to be the endogenous productivity component, and then the green area, that's capital deepened. Okay, so over the long run, when I cut corporate taxes, even for a short period of time, firms are going to accumulate, there's going to be more R&D and adoption. So this endogenous piece is going to grow, but of course, physical capital is complementary to that, to those technologies. So also there's investment in capital. What about for the personal income tax cut? Okay, that's more like a sugar rush. Okay, so this blue area, that's labor utilization. Okay, so when I cut their taxes, workers work harder. That explains this kind of short run jump in productivity, and that fades relatively quickly. Okay, so the almost final thing I'm going to show you is some counterfactuals for the model. Okay, what happens as I change features of the model? The first thing I'm showing you, I think, is what happens in the model. Okay, so same estimates. I'm just going to switch off endogenous productivity. Okay, so just going to focus on this panel here in the middle. Okay, this is the responsive labor productivity. The black line, that's the baseline I just showed you, the decomposition, in which endogenous productivity and capital deepening both accounted for the persistent responsive productivity. This green line, this is a counterfactual in which the only channel is capital accumulation. Okay, so you can see that basically the entire persistence of the response is gone once I switch off endogenous productivity. What that means is capital accumulation alone cannot explain with plausible parameters this really persistent responsive productivity. Okay, this turns out to have some important policy implications. Okay, because if you look at how the CBO, that's what it's called, right? Now I'm panicking. The CBO scores tax cuts. They basically think the long-run effect of tax cuts is all about this capital accumulation, and they don't think about this piece here, this endogenous productivity. You can see if you're thinking the only long-run effect of tax cuts is about capital accumulation, you're essentially missing a really large part of the response. It's not true that they completely ignore R&D, but they certainly don't treat it in a way consistent with how we think about it in our theory. Okay, so switching off R&D, the response of labor productivity is essentially gone. The next counterfactual I want to show you is what happens if I make the tax system treat R&D more favorably. Okay, I'm going to let firms deduct more of the cost of purchasing R&D. I'm going to provide a greater subsidy through the tax system for the purchase of intellectual property products. So you can see that switching off endogenous productivity and this other counterfactual with higher deductions for ID purchases look very, very similar to each other. Okay, so the effect of changing the tax system so that firms can now deduct a greater share of the cost, the response to a cut on corporate taxes looks kind of the same as in a model with no endogenous productivity. Okay, the responses of the labor to the personal income tax shock look very different. Okay, so from my perspective, the two are not observationally equivalent because I get information out of this response to the personal income tax shock. But if I only looked at the response of corporate tax cut, the tax code plays a really large role in explaining how these shocks translate. Okay, that's not to say that a world in which there's endogenous TFP is the same, because of course, if I have this high IP deduction, that also means that in steady state, there's a lot more technology adoption. Okay, so the level of the economy is much larger in this world, but the response of the economy to this shock looks very similar. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Yes, I'm going to end on this slide here. Actually, sorry, let me just say one thing, because so far what I've said is it kind of sounds like personal income tax cuts don't matter. Okay, and that's not true. Okay, the reason that they look like they don't matter and what I've showed you is because in fact, in the data, those shocks are really transitory. They're more transitory than the corporate income tax cuts. Okay, so to give you an idea, to put these on an equal footing, what I've plotted here is the labor productivity decomposition for another experiment in which I do permanent tax cuts. Okay, I'm going to cut corporate taxes permanently. I'm going to cut personal taxes permanently. And this is what the responses look like. Okay, this is a 1% cut in the corporate tax rate, a 1% cut in the personal tax rate. Okay, so of course, the tax base for the personal income is an order of magnitude larger than for the corporate income tax. Okay, so this is very expensive in revenue terms. This is relatively cheap in revenue terms. Okay, so they're not like for like, this is 1% cut. So what does it look like? You can see that for a 1% permanent cut in the corporate tax rate, the model says long-run GDP goes up about 3%. For 1% cut in the personal income tax rate, long-run GDP goes up about 1.5%. Okay, you can see that the explanations are similar. Mostly, it's about endogenous TFP, but that also, of course, leads to more capital accumulation. And okay, finally, this is a model in which what we're saying is the world looks kind of neoclassical. Okay, I cut taxes, the prices of goods go up, therefore that encourages me to produce more goods. And we're applying that logic to the production of intellectual property. Okay, so this is some evidence, some more direct evidence that channel is present in the world. Okay, so I guess the first sense check is this is stock returns. Okay, so we see persistent positive responses of the value of the stock market to the cuts in corporate tax rates. We also see persistent responses in patent filings. Maybe more subtle, this here, trademark transactions. This is a measure. Okay, this is the response to the corporate tax cut for how frequently firms buy trademarks from each other. In other words, when I cut corporate taxes, what happens is firms trade more in trademarks. I start buying more brands, I start buying more products from other firms. There's more trade in intellectual property in response to the corporate tax cut. And finally, the value of intangibles. Okay, so like a finer grain measure of the stuff that we're thinking about here, okay, those kind of intellectual property products, you can also see a positive long response. Okay, so I'll leave you with that. So new evidence on the effect of tax cuts. If you want to take one number away, a 1% transitory corporate income tax cut, 0.75% higher labor productivity 10 years out. Why? Because even transitory changes in corporate tax cuts drive increases in R&D and applied research. And that explains the persistence of the responses. Okay.
Thank you. Some questions?
Since you showed the stock market, and you already by the stock market response, because that should be the one that front loads everything.
Yeah.
So I would like, if this had been now 4% initially.
Love it. Great question. So what we're working on now, okay, this is the entire stock market. And of course, innovation is a relatively small part. Okay, so what we're working on now is in splitting the sample of stock returns into maybe like high patent and low patent firms. We have some preliminary evidence that the more intellectual property rich a firm is, the higher its response on impact. Okay, so exactly getting at your comment. Okay, so that'll be in the paper hopefully soon. Yeah.
That chart and also the initial chart on taxes, they seem to be just at a trend.
Where are we
I
looking?
think the stock market return chart. So if I think about it, I don't know where actually the data is, but you had an upward trend in stock markets over your sample period, and presumably the tax on average were also over the sample period. So
these responses are all relative to trend, right?
they are relative.
Yes, everything is relative to trend, including taxes. Corporate taxes, in fact, fall dramatically over the sample period. So the shocks we observe are also shocks relative to that trend. Absolutely.
So, question about your model, about how your model differentiates between, as you know, the cuts in corporate taxes themselves just for everybody, and the change over time in the R&D and deductibility, because it's not been stable either in the US, particularly over the sample that you're talking about.
Yeah, so there's one change in that. In 1993, there was the introduction of so one thing that's that we're kind of lucky with is the Roma and Roma sample is not every legislative change in federal taxes, it's a subset. And we're just lucky in that a lot of the kind of gnarly issues we managed to avoid. So for instance, when the deductibility of R&D was increased, that specific episode is not in our sample. So of course, that's not a complete answer to your question. The other thing we can do is, so we don't have a lot of shocks, so we don't have like a massive amount of power. What we do is we re-estimate everything, dropping one episode at a time. Okay, so when I first saw these results, I told my co-authors, this is all about Reagan. Okay, so it turns out even when you drop the Reagan tax cuts, you know, the effects look remarkably stable, dropping one specific episode.
That's very interesting. That was one of my follow-ups. My other thing is that your sample doesn't go past 2006, obviously.
That's right.
The question I'm going to ask now is probably mostly irrelevant, but the fact this the stock market, a huge amount of what's going on in terms of R&D and intellectual property now is not in public companies. It's in the private companies, very private, and so you don't. Their stock prices do not exist, and so that's very much the last 15 years kind of phenomenon, as opposed to prior to that. So I don't know. You might be able to tease it out from patent filings and stuff like that.
Yes.
But if you're relying on truly just corporate data, if there's any hope in the future to carry this forward, you're going to have to do something about it.
Absolutely. That's very interesting because what also has happened is, of course, a really liquid market and trade in those private firms has emerged. And so I was talking to some accounting people about this. And, you know, private equity firms, part of what they're thinking is, how do I, which firm do I purchase so that I can maximize the deductions I get for buying this intellectual property?
Well, and then I was going to ask you what you did about carried interest too. That's a bridge too far. Which is, the more private they are, then the tax rate is completely different.
Right. So that's something that's hard to capture. Yeah. So stopping in 2006 is a great thing for us.
Spend a weekend on the US tax notes.
Do you guys have time? Okay, I'm done.
Thank you for being here. Thank you to the organizers for putting up on the program. So the usual, since I'm also at the Fed now, the usual Fed disclaimer on the paper applies. So the question we're after in this paper is, how long do the effects of monetary contractions or monetary interventions last? This is an old question. To get at it, what we do here is we use a historical panel that spans 115 years of data starting 1900 up until 2015. It's for 17 now advanced economies. I'll tell you what the countries are. The main variables we're going to look at are GDP, that's the main variable of interest. Do monetary shocks, do they have very persistent effect on GDP and how persistent? And in the spirit of a solo decomposition, we also want to look at what channels may be operating. Like unlike the previous two papers, we don't have data on R&D or investment in patents and so forth. So we're going to take a stock of it through a broader level and looking at capital, labor, and what we're going to call the residual as a TFP. The identification here is going to come from the trilemma idea in international finance. I'm going to spend some time on this, but very briefly, if a country is pegged to another country, let's call the Denmark is pegged to the US during the Bretton Woods, then if US changes interest rates, Danish interest rates are going to move in the same direction. There's going to be a positive correlation, and that positive correlation is what we're going to need to construct an instrumental variable. Then we're going to use local projections instrumental variable methods to estimate these impulse responses of these identified monetary shocks. In our sample, we won't have identification of shocks for the US and the UK because much of history, US and UK were base countries, which other countries were pegging. So what we're going to do is also check for validity of our results for US and the UK. What we find in this paper is we find large and very persistent effects of these monetary shocks. So 12 years out, GDP is lower relative to a pre-shock trend by about 3 to 5 percentage points, depending on what sample you look at, full sample or just a post-World War II sample. When we look under the hood in the spirit of a solo decomposition, we find labor falls, crisis, financial monetary shock induces a recession, but labor returns back to the pre-shock trend 12 years out, 12 years later. What doesn't return and what explains why GDP is persistently lower are capital and TFP. So this, to some extent, suggests this that models of endogenous growth, semi-endogenous growth, could be driving these movements that we see in GDP. Now, going beyond that, we also want to know whether loosening shocks and contractionary shocks have similar effects or not. Like if contractionary shocks destroy the economy and you have this scarring effect, can loosening shock and central bank reverse those shocks and undo these effects? So what we find is there's an asymmetry, there's a sign asymmetry. Loosening shocks tend to not have these persistent effects. So the word harmful and harmless is in terms of these persistent effects. And whereas tightening shocks have these very, very persistent effects in the historical data. Now, as I already alluded to, we don't have identification for the US and the UK economies. So what we're going to do is we basically take these these recently published papers in the AER, Asian Macro, and European Economic Review, which have identification of monetary shocks for the US and the UK. For the US, Drehmann, Paolo, Sastry, and Sims, they have identification by the Surico bond heteroscedasticity. There is a Volcker episode with a lot of volatility, and then there's a non-Volcker episode with not as much volatility, and identify monetary shocks using that idea. And then there is a Miranda, Gripino, and Rico paper, which take these Gertler-Karabi high-frequency shocks, but cleans them for information effects by projecting them on Green Book forecasts. It takes a residual. So we basically just download the code and extend. All we do is their horizon for impulse responses is 48 months. We say change 48 to 96, and we estimate the impulse responses. We also look at evidence for the UK. These are again high frequency instruments for the UK that Cesabianchi and co-authors is constructed. So since we only have 15 minutes more, we're going to jump directly to the empirical analysis. So what we do is we use this data set that Oscar and Alan have with Morris Shularik. It's a Jorda-Shularik-Taylor macro history database, where we have data on interest rates, output, investment, inflation, house prices, stock prices, various kinds of financial variables. This is for 17 now advanced economies. These are Australia, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, and the US. We combine this database with the database constructed by economists, which some of them used to be the Bank of France. It's called long-term productivity database, from where we have information on hours worked, number of employees, take a product of these two variables, we call that labor. Then they constructed capital stock using perpetual inventory methods from investment in machines and buildings. We played around with various ways of constructing this capital stock measure. Our results are a robust variety of growth rate estimates for initial values that we use. And then, so this is a labor, this is K, we impose a Cobb-Douglas aggregate reduction function with a capital share, and we back out a solo residual that we're going to call TF. So this is the annual data from 1900 to 2015. We exclude world wars in our sample. So how does the identification of shock work? The identification of shock really comes from this other paper that Alan and Oscar have with Morris Shularik. It's in JME. We're going to divide the population of countries into three subpopulations. There are going to be peg countries, Denmark in the Bretton Woods. They're going to be base countries, US in the Bretton Woods. And they're going to be float countries which are not pegging to the US. in that sample. So going to think of capital mobility, we think of we're going to use the index. It's a continuous index in international finance literature constructed by Quinchin and Toyota, where 1 denotes capital openness. 0 is capital close to capital account, 1 is open. We're going to classify a country to be pegging if it not only pegged its currency this year, but it also pegged its currency last year. This to think of a little bit of selection into and out of peg. So you have to be in a peg for at least 2 years for us to think of that as a consider a shock. The definition of peg here comes from J. Schambog and Ilvesky Reinhard Rogo classification, where the exchange rate moves within plus minus 2% exchange rate band. Instrument that we construct then, Z for a country J at time T, is basically this interest rate residual. So this is the interest rate change, annual year-on-year interest rate change in the base country that corresponds to country J. We don't need to take the raw interest rate changes. We residualize these interest rate changes by projecting these interest rates on base country macro financial controls and their lags. We don't have data on expectations. Ideally, you want to project them on expectations and what the policymakers wanted to do. This is a long sample. So this is that sort of a cleaning strategy in terms of residualizing, so that we can think of that these shocks are not anticipated to the extent that base country macro financial variables don't predict them. We're going to take that residual and adjust for capital mobility. So at home, country home is J, which is in a peg. The intervention variable is going to be interest rate on a short-term government, nominal interest in a short-term government bill. The trilemma instrument is a variable Z, and then we're going to look at effects of these instrumented interest rate changes on macroeconomic variables in Denmark, for example, during Bretton Woods. So look at what the residualized interest rate changes look like. So these are just interest rate changes in the base country. So this graph gives you an idea of throughout our sample what the base countries have been. So in the pre-World War I, UK is classified as a base country. Between the world wars, there's a hybrid of UK, US, and France. We put a weight of 1/3 on each. The results don't really depend on that much. Then in the post-World War II, we have UK as a base country for Australia up until 1968. And then we have US largely as a base country for countries. And then in the European monetary system, Germany emerges as a base country. And these are interest rate changes in the base country in our sample. So the big episodes are there's a tightening in the around the Great Depression. Then there is a Volcker episode in Germany. You see Otto Kohl was a Bundesbank governor, president, and then in the Volcker period. And then some tightening around the financial crisis. So the first stage, in first stage, we are regressing interest rates in the home country, country J, on the instrument that we constructed. We take the residualized interest rate changes, adjust for capital mobility, that's the variable Z. And then you have a vector of home economy, macro financial controls. It's basically a kitchen sink. We have stock prices, house prices, long-term interest rates, short-term interest rates, the lags of short-term interest rates, and a variety of other variables. And then a country fixed effects. So what this table shows you is the pass-through. So when this instrument goes up by 100 basis points, the pass-through into home interest rates is about 60 basis points. It's large, it's not one-to-one, but it's two things to take away is this pass-through is significant, and the P statistics are pretty large. So you don't have a weak instrument problem. Now you can rationalize these coefficients from a 2% exchange rate band. If you took a Krugman-Swenson exchange rate band model, which is what Alan and Maury and J. Schambog did in their statistics paper. So you have the first stage interest rate changes that are instrumented by this instrument. Then what you do is we're going to do is local projections to estimate the cumulative impulse response function of a variable y, country J, at horizon H relative to horizon -1. These are horizon specific country fixed effects, vector of home economy macro financial controls, and beta H is going to directly give us the cumulative impulse response of GDP for Denmark at horizon 10 or horizon 5, relative to horizon -1. Just think of this as a pre-shock trend in this exercise. The standard errors, we're going to cluster them at the country level, and we're going to use Driscoll-Gray standard errors to think of spatial. We also have in the main exercise we did spatial correction with the spatial autocorrelation correction with the Driscoll-Gray. So this is the main result. The main result here we're plotting is impulse response of GDP in the pegging country 12 years out, this is years, to 100 basis point interest rate treatment at home. There's a full sample, 1900, 2015, post-World War II sample, 1948, 2015. The bands here are 68 and 95% Driscoll-Gray standard bands. What you see is, in response to this interest rate shock, which makes home interest rate go up by 100 basis point, GDP is lower by about 5 or 3 percentage points, depending on the sample you look at. And 12 years out, it has a very persistent effect on macroeconomic variable with GDP. To see what Joseba was showing, that these shocks are really temporary, they're transitory. You see that here is the home nominal interest rate, a short-term interest rate, the 3-month interest rate on 3-month government bill. It's normalized to go up by 100 basis points, but then within 3 to 4 years, it comes back to 0. So it is a response to a transitory interest rate movement that we find this effect 12 years out. You see, as you would expect, there is this prices fall, and it's a demand-driven shock, and that's what you see there. Now we do a lot of robustness. There are lots of obvious concerns with the exercise that we have done. It's a long sample. You want to first think of maybe the pre-trends. Was the question came up with the was asking this question, was GDP already declining before this shock happened? So we've added 2 annual lags of control. So this is why this coefficient is 0. But then we don't really see 8 years back. There are no pre-trends in this exercise. Other question is what Joseba was alluding to. In our sample, we have a panel local projection. So we drop one country at a time to see and re-estimate the impulse responses and see whether those have this persistent effect or not. We find that barely changes the picture. They're all seem to have these very tight, no one country is moving our sample, our results. When we drop 5-year windows at a time, you may worry there are this particular episode, maybe Great Depression is driving the result, maybe financial crisis is driving the result, maybe Volcker tight episode is driving the results. We find it seems to be still very, very persistent effects of those shocks. We also have a small open economy New Keynesian model. The idea of that model in the paper is to think about exclusion restriction violations, right? So you may be worried that it's not really because of the interest rate pass through that you have this effect in GDP, but there are these other channels. For example, in open economy, if US goes into a recession, it reduces demand for tradable goods from Denmark, and that's another channel. It's not really the interest rate channel that's happening, but it's the demand for tradable goods that's going on. So the instrument may have an effect on variable through channels that don't go through interest rates, right? And so what we do is we use the model to put bounds on the tradable demand, for example, and then we re-estimate this exercise using a control function approach. And what we find is this shaded area, probably it's hard to see it, there is a green shaded area, which is a spillover corrected impulse response, and we find it's within the confidence bands. We also go beyond the model and say, well, you may be worried there are base country macroeconomic variables may matter. You may be worried there are global trends. So if global GDP goes into a recession, it's just a structural break in some sense that may be affecting the results. You may be worried that there is spillovers that happen through current account or spillovers that happen through exchange rates. We control for these open economy variables, also current value and 2 lags in the spirit of thinking of exclusion restriction violation in this exercise. We estimate by using Paolo, we estimate 5 structural break dates for each country in TFP growth process. We add those structural break dates. We find very persistent effects of GDP. Now, thinking about what are the mechanisms through which these persistent effects may be propagating, what we do is we do a solar decomposition. We look at responses of labor, capital, and the constructed solar residual. So this is the response of GDP, the first column here, which I showed you earlier, that in response to monetary shock, GDP is lowered by about 4.5 percentage points in the full sample. Labor falls, but it comes back. So 12 years out, it's back to the pre-shock trend. Capital in TFP is where you see this persistent effect. And importantly, the magnitude that you see with capital in TFP seems to suggest there is some co-integration as would come out of endogenous growth models, that capital and TFP are co-integrated, and you kind of see that in this graph. Now, when you think of whether contractionary expansion shocks have the same persistent effect, we look at whether interest rates tightening in the base economy, what are the effects of those interest rate tightenings on the pegging economy or the instrument to the instrument. We find the effects are larger than in the sample where you treat the shock symmetric. Labor response is a bit more pronounced now, and you see big effects in capital and TFP. But if you look at expansionary shocks, you don't see these persistent effects here. Just for the sake of comparison, we change the coefficient of the shock so that we can compare the same axes. So it's again expansionary shock, but just written in a negative way to be able to compare the axes. And you see these aren't statistically significant permanent responses or persistent responses that we see. Now, that's largely our paper's identification from using a trilemma instrument or this long sample that spans 115 years. We also basically went to these replication packages in AEJ Macro, AER, and European Economic Review, downloaded these replication packages and changed 48 to 96 months. And these are basically impulse responses from shocks that other people have. This is from Miranda, Agrippino, Rico. This is the interest rates identified through a VAR in a Gertler-Karadi VAR, which has financial variables, excess bond premium, etc. in it, but they are cleaned of information effect. So interest rates go up in the US. By year 2, they're back to 0, whereas these effects by year 8, you seem to have very persistent, not as big as we found in the trilemma IV, but they are pretty large. This is Bromaya Palia Sims, which is identification with heteroscedasticity. Here you find a bit more pronounced effects, more like our identification. You see interest rates are high, remain elevated for about 4 years in this exercise. And you see industrial production effects are a bit more sizable than the previous one. And then, so this is for the UK, same exercise in the UK. These guys have a monthly estimate of GDP. The growth rates go up by 100 basis points, and then by year 2, they're back to 0. And you see this very persistent effects 8 years out on GDP. So that's a paper. So we find evidence that effects of monetary interventions may be more persistent than we have commonly believed. Monetary tightening shock causes output to decline over a long period of time, and we find this effect goes through capital stock and TFP. In the paper, we also have evidence to show how this identification in principle could work in a small open economy New Keynesian model, to think about various margins in which the identification fail and how we can think about it in the empirics. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Okay, we'll open the floor to questions. I have lots of questions.
It's about commonalities in your, for example, I'll give you such a long example. Maybe it's not a way part of the information that he's adjust for this, but it occurred to me that my best guess would be is the shocks and the monetary policy responses are way more affordable across countries in the second half of your sample than in the first part of your sample, where things may have been more heterogeneous. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's what my intuition. So I should never say this. You're just starting in the room. It's bad. He's gonna correct me. And so I guess I have a kind of open-ended question about what sort of a role, if anything, that would play in your. You seem to have pretty similar results regardless across the two hats, but I'm just curious as to whether that could be important.
So there was in the previous version of the paper, we even started in 1870. In the first paper, this data set goes to 1870. The reason we start 1900 is we want to compare with the long-term productivity database. There you see much bigger effects. These effects they do become bigger. It just worked out that focusing on 1900, 2015 allowed us to show similar responses across. These were even bigger, to be unpalatable in some sense, that people were wondering. These are pretty large. So, but if we go back, start at 1890 or 1870, you would see this going down to about 7% or 6%. So that's a small.
Kind of fits my intuition,
but also I should have said Alan will take all the questions.
Yeah.
Right. You go back to the shocks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, because we're focusing just on what's being driven by the base country, we've only got one or two bases, like so in that sense, other countries may be doing monetary policy shocks, but we're not paying attention. But we're just restricting to things driven by what these things do. So we're missing a lot of other shocks, which is why we show that other identification in US UK. But these shocks alone seem like a clean way to focus on countries that would give monetary autonomy to some people.
Oh no, that logic makes a lot of sense to me, but it was more than I thought that the sheer volatility in the earlier part of this thing would just be more important than it is tonight.
It is,
which
it is.
The 19th century to find it. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, there's more volatility in the bases once we get the bulk of it's like all kinds of stuff going on. So.
Can I ask a question to the interpretation? In some sense, it's a bit depressing for a policymaker to think, I'm going to depress long run growth. But maybe I'm thinking it wrong, but in terms of
the asymmetry.
Yeah, the asymmetry.
You can only screw up, you can't make things better.
Yeah, so and then you have very little impact on inflation. I think as far was quite very significant, actually not significant.
In the post-World sample, it's a bit more substantial than the full sample.
Okay. But then I was thinking, in some sense, it's sort of more, or maybe I'm misinterpreting. Because the shocks like something like I'm basically forced to tighten my rates plan because I'm paying. So even though they're not aligned with my fundamentals, that's basically what I'm looking at. So it's basically if I screw up, that's the bad thing. I mean, I could also interpret it something unwarranted to macro fundamentals screws me up in the long run. Isn't that what we really show? Maybe that's an interpretation question.
Yeah, but the theory part of this shows that under some assumptions, what you recover from this impulse response, if I'm saying Spain forced by paying Germany to raise by 100 bits, accidentally against my will. That impulse response is the same as if I was Spain on the table rule and I accidentally make that 100 basis points. So they're
So we spell out the condition and
right. And the referee response to that is either that's obvious or what?
But why don't we actually use a table rule? Because you're cleaning up with sort of
we do a table rule for the basis. We want to say, okay, well,
but not for
what is Spaniards are predicting what the bonus banks do?
No, but for the pegging countries, it's implicitly here. You're controlling for vector of macro financial variables, which includes
implicitly, but you could have just done Taylor rule and then see how much is my interest rate deviates from.
But this is the Taylor rule, right? So this is the instrument that makes the interest rate move. This is controlling for base economy, macro financial control variables, right? Lags, not contemporaneous one, but lags. So say like, could anything that happened last 2 years predict interest rate changes? You say, I want to clean that away and just focus on the instrumented ones. So in the sense, it is doing that for this country as well. Yeah.
If you like, the concept is we don't have like high frequency, intraday changes in the curve or something, or futures going back to the 19th century. So we can't do the high frequency of it. We're not just spending 100 years in the archives doing narratives for 17 times.
No.
So,
I think that's the instrument.
It's like, okay,
But this one does it, right? They take the Göttler-Karadi instruments and regress them on Green Book forecasts, which takes into account expectations.
I think some historians have actually gone back to banking in the archives and started to do what did they do in the 19th century, like what was daily change. And I'm doing some of that with 50s and the pension. Like going to the FT and so, when the bank did this in 1963, the government announced something. But yeah, that no one's done any of that really, but much before 1990.
And she was digging around in the basement of the videos that's going on. That's really best. I don't appreciate it.
Annual distribution, but to get out the market effects is super strong. So I tried to figure out a model where the cost of borrowing instead of 4%, now it's 5% for 2 years accidentally. And then after 2 years, it's back to normal, right? And now, 8 years later, GDP is 5% just because of this period of 2 years of interest rates that were a little bit too high. I tried to picture a model.
With the models which Joseba presented, a semi-endogenous growth model, if you have
We have that in the appendix.
basically strong aggregate demand effects. In Joseba's model, it has more flexible prices towards more flexible part, but if you had more demand effects, so we have a recession, the economy is in a recession, GDP is lower, the market size shrinks for your R&D, so you reduce R&D in this Agin-Howard kind of models, and that temporary reduction.
If you this 1 percentage point extra for 2 years, does this generate already an recession?
Yeah.
It is. This is the monetary shocks literature.
All the papers.
That's the monetary shocks literature generating.
It has been 1 year or 2 years. So the question is, the history of this method gets that short run negative shocks is somehow has to into stock variables like the capital or PFP or patterns or innovation. And yeah, we can calibrate a model to do that. We can calibrate a model to do anything, but it's not out of line with what that literature finds.
But just it's not NBR recession, it's just like saying GDP falls, industrial production falls, right? That's what the thing. You're not saying predicting NBR dating recessions with these monetary shocks.
So yeah, we have no shame, right? So these other authors always stop at 36 or 48 months because they're ashamed of what happens.
Exactly.
And we're like, let's pull back the curve. You can see what happens. It keeps going. And so
It's just, I guess they are a little bit afraid of showing that because they think the model gets less credit when they show it. No, you pull back the curve.
But this is just you saying.
confidence in I mean, it's still confidence in one's county. Maybe you should never like it. I know what you're saying, but we're kind of afraid to show it. We got over it.
Thank you so much.